For many years a strange and troubling tradition existed in China foot binding. This custom, meant to make young girls' feet into small, lotus feet, reminds us of how complicated ideas of beauty can be, and the extreme things societies do to achieve them. These lotus feet, though seen as beautiful, cause terrible physical and emotional pain, leaving women disabled and unable to move freely. Foot binding, a mysterious and often misunderstood practice, still fascinates historians, anthropologists, and anyone interested in different cultures. How did such a painful custom begin? And why did it last for centuries, becoming such a big part of Chinese culture? Join us as we explore the history and culture behind the captivating and disturbing story of foot binding in China. The beginnings of foot binding, like the tight silk wrappings that hid the deformed feet, are hidden in mystery. One clue takes us back to the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, a time of political chaos and cultural change. Some stories talk about Yao Niang, a beautiful concubine with delicate feet, who charmed Emperor Li Yu by dancing on a golden lotus platform. Foot binding became more noticeable during the Song dynasty. We see it in art, literature, and most importantly in the lives of women outside the royal court. The Song era, a time of wealth and artistic growth, saw changes in social rules and ideas of beauty, allowing foot binding to become more popular. Tiny, bound feet called golden lotuses became a symbol of being Han Chinese, setting them apart from other groups. To learn more about foot binding, we look to archaeology for real evidence of how it changed and affected women's lives. The most telling artifacts are the shoes, tiny, beautifully made lotus shoes for bound feet. These shoes, often made of silk or cotton with fancy designs, show us how tastes changed and how extreme foot binding became. The Ming, 1368 to 1644, and Qing, 1644 to 1912 dynasties, were the peak of foot binding in China. Once mainly for the upper class, it spread to almost all levels of Han Chinese society. The Ming dynasty, focused on traditional Han Chinese culture, saw foot binding become even more common. By the height of the Qing dynasty, it's thought that 40 to 50% of all Chinese women and almost all upper-class Han Chinese women had bound feet. To understand why foot binding lasted so long, we need to look beyond beauty and at the social and economic reasons. Bound feet became connected to social status, marriage prospects, and a woman's worth. The size and shape of her feet showed her family's wealth, with the smallest golden lotuses, meaning refinement and the ability to afford this expensive custom. Even though foot binding was widespread during the Ming and Qing dynasties, how common and extreme it was differed by region and ethnic group. In the south, especially in Guangdong and Guangxi, it was less common and less extreme than in the north. The Hakka people, a Han Chinese group known for moving around and their strong culture, also rejected foot binding. The image of the bound foot, often seen as still and perfect, hides the strength of the women who lived with this change to their bodies. Foot binding limited their movement and kept them out of some public life, but it didn't make them powerless. Female poets, painters, and calligraphers still created beautiful works, showing that bound feet didn't stop their creativity. Foot binding, a ritual wrapped in tradition and pain, started when girls were just 4 or 5. Their toes were curled under, and the arch of the foot was broken. Bandages, often soaked in herbs, were tightly wrapped around the foot, forcing the toes and heel together. Foot binding caused serious lifelong problems. Infection was common. Tight bandages caused ingrown toenails and sores. These wounds without enough blood flow could get infected, leading to gangrene and lost toes. Crushed feet meant poor circulation, constant pain, and cold feet. Women had to walk on their heels, creating an unsteady walk. This put stress on knees, hips, and spine, causing arthritis. Many women had trouble walking and fell easily. As they aged, they were more likely to break bones, especially their hips. The constant pressure caused lifelong pain. Despite these problems, women still had to do housework and have children. This shows the extremes people went to for cultural beauty standards. Foot binding deeply affected women's mental and emotional health. From a young age, girls felt terrible pain and helplessness, reminding them of their lower status in society, where their worth was tied to their looks. Bound feet also made girls less mobile, making them lonely as they watched others play freely. As they grew, the pressure to keep their bound feet and the fear of not getting married added to their emotional burden. They felt both pride in their endurance and shame for their condition. Despite this, many women found ways to cope. The shared experience created a sense of support and understanding. This shows their strength in a world that both admired and limited them. Despite the challenges, women with bound feet showed amazing strength. At home, they did handiwork like embroidery, weaving and sewing. These skills provided income and a way to express themselves. Some women even ran businesses or traded, showing they weren't helpless. They adapted to their limitations with creativity and determination. Socially, these women formed close groups, supporting each other. This shared experience, while painful, created a strong bond. Their lives were complex, showing pain, endurance, and adaptation. Foot binding limited them, but it didn't define them. Their stories show the strength of the human spirit. Even though foot binding was deeply rooted in Chinese culture, some people spoke against it. This practice, which began in the Song Dynasty, was seen as a symbol of beauty and status. However, it caused immense pain and suffering for countless women. The process involved breaking the arch of the foot and binding it tightly to achieve the desired small size, often leading to lifelong disabilities. Despite its prevalence, there were those who recognized its brutality and dared to voice their opposition. These early voices, though often ignored, started the change that would end this tradition. Their courage to speak out planted the seeds of change, challenging the deeply ingrained societal norms. Over time, their persistent efforts began to resonate with more people, slowly shifting public perception. The journey to abolish foot binding was long and arduous, but these initial critics played a crucial role in sparking the conversation. One early critic was the 13th century scholar Che Roshui. He was a prominent figure who used his influence to highlight the detrimental effects of foot binding. His writings were poignant and thought-provoking, questioning the rationale behind such a cruel practice. Che Roshui's work was a beacon of hope for those who suffered in silence, offering a glimmer of possibility for change. He wrote about the pain inflicted on young girls, asking why such suffering was necessary. His vivid descriptions of the agony endured by these young girls were meant to stir the conscience of society. He argued that no aesthetic ideal was worth the physical and emotional torment that foot binding caused. His words were a powerful indictment of the practice, urging people to reconsider their values and traditions. His words, though ignored at the time, showed a growing awareness of the cruelty of foot binding. Che Roshui's writings were preserved in historical manuscripts, serving as a testament to his forward-thinking views. Although his contemporaries may not have heeded his warnings, his work laid the groundwork for future generations to build upon. His legacy is a reminder that change often begins with a single voice willing to speak out against injustice. Other critics came from Confucian moralists. These scholars, who were deeply respected in society, also began to question the practice. They approached the issue from a moral and ethical standpoint, arguing that foot binding was incompatible with Confucian values of humanity and righteousness. Their critiques added a philosophical dimension to the debate, challenging the cultural and ethical justifications for foot binding. They didn't want to end foot binding completely, but they criticized how it made women into objects of male desire. These moralists believed that women should be valued for their virtues and intelligence rather than their physical appearance. They argued that foot binding reduced women to mere objects of beauty, stripping them of their dignity and humanity. Their critiques were a call to elevate the status of women in society, advocating for a more holistic view of female worth. They wanted a broader view of female beauty, including virtue and intelligence. These early critics envisioned a society where women were appreciated for their inner qualities and contributions. They believed that true beauty lay in a person's character and intellect, not in the artificial and harmful practice of foot binding. Their vision was progressive for its time, challenging the narrow definitions of beauty that had long dominated Chinese culture. These early critiques chipped away at the support for foot binding. Over time, their persistent efforts began to erode the cultural acceptance of the practice. Each critique was like a small crack in the foundation of a long-standing tradition, gradually weakening its hold on society. The combined voices of these early critics set the stage for future reformers who would eventually succeed in abolishing foot binding altogether. In the 1800s, China faced big changes, dealing with internal conflicts and pressure from the West. This is when the movement against foot binding grew stronger. Christian missionaries arriving in larger numbers spoke out against foot binding. They saw it as barbaric, started schools for girls, and spread messages against it. At the same time, Chinese intellectuals, influenced by Western ideas, saw foot binding as a symbol of China's problems. Reformers like Liang Qichao argued that it weakened the nation. The movement faced resistance. Traditionalists saw foot binding as essential to Chinese culture and social order, but things were changing. The ideas of change, planted by early critics and reformers, were growing. The end of foot binding wasn't sudden, but slow. This ancient practice, which had been deeply ingrained in Chinese culture for over 1,000 years, began to wane as the country moved towards modernization. The process of change was gradual, reflecting the deep-rooted traditions and the resistance to altering long-standing customs. It was officially banned in 1912, but old customs, especially in rural areas, were hard to change. The practice of foot binding had been a symbol of beauty and status, making it difficult for many to let go. In the countryside, where traditions held strong, the ban was often ignored, and the painful practice continued. The movement to end foot binding was strongest in cities, where Western ideas and educated women were more influential. Urban areas were more exposed to new ideologies and the influence of foreign cultures, which promoted the idea of natural beauty and condemned the practice as barbaric. Urban families abandoned the practice more readily. The influence of education and the desire to modernize played a significant role in this shift. Families in cities were more likely to see the benefits of unbound feet, such as better mobility and health for their daughters. But in rural areas, tradition and economic hardship meant foot binding continued. For many rural families, bound feet were seen as a way to secure a good marriage for their daughters, which was crucial for economic survival. The practice was intertwined with social and economic structures that were hard to dismantle. Families feared social disapproval and economic problems. The pressure to conform to societal expectations was immense, and the fear of being ostracized or facing financial difficulties kept the practice alive in many rural communities. Reformers used different methods to end foot binding. They understood that simply banning the practice was not enough. Efforts were made to educate the public about the health risks and the inhumanity of the practice. Groups organized protests, spread information, and helped families who kept their daughters' feet unbound. These reformers worked tirelessly, often facing resistance, to change public perception and encourage a shift in societal norms. Schools taught girls about the dangers of foot binding. Education played a crucial role in this transformation, as young girls learned about the physical and psychological harm caused by the practice. Despite these efforts, foot binding continued in some remote areas into the 1900s. The isolation of these communities made it difficult for reformers to reach them, and the practice persisted among the older generations who clung to tradition. The last known case was in 1957, marking the end of a painful chapter. This final instance symbolized the closing of an era as China moved forward, leaving behind a practice that had caused immense suffering for countless women over the centuries. Foot binding may be gone, but its effects remain in China's ideas about beauty, gender roles, and its history. The scars are not just on the bodies of older women, but also on the nation's memory. After the ban, foot binding became a source of shame, a symbol of oppression. It still shapes discussions about women's rights and tradition. It's a warning about how cultural practices can be harmful, but it's also a story of women's strength and the power of social reform. As China changes, there's a movement to understand foot binding in new ways, not just as victimhood, but with more complexity. Artists, writers, and filmmakers are exploring the complicated mix of beauty, pain, and tradition. They challenge us to think about its lasting impact. This goes beyond art. People want to hear from women who experienced foot-binding to understand their suffering and strength. Oral histories, museums, and research are sharing their stories. Foot-binding reminds us that ideas of beauty are not fixed, but change with culture. By facing this history, China is talking about tradition, women's control over their bodies, and how beauty is defined in a changing world. Foot-binding shows us the complicated nature of history and cultural norms. This practice, which began in the 10th century, was deeply rooted in the desire to conform to societal standards of beauty and status. It was believed that small feet, often referred to as lotus feet, were a mark of elegance and refinement. However, the process was excruciating and had lifelong consequences for the women who underwent it. It reminds us of the extremes people went to for beauty, often hurting those considered beautiful. The binding process started at a young age, usually between 4 and 9 years old, and involved breaking the arch of the foot and curling the toes under. This was done to achieve the desired foot size, which was ideally around 3 inches long. The pain was immense, and the risk of infection and permanent disability was high. The small, deformed feet, once a sign of status, are now a symbol of pain and women's strength. Despite the suffering, many women took pride in their bound feet, as it was a sign of their family's social standing and their own perseverance. Today, these deformed feet serve as a poignant reminder of the lengths to which people will go to meet societal expectations. Through foot-binding, we see how a culture changes, the push and pull of tradition and progress, and how people adapt to societal expectations. The practice was officially banned in the early 20th century, but it took decades for it to completely disappear. This transition period highlights the struggle between maintaining cultural heritage and embracing modern values. We see the harm of limiting women's freedom and the amazing ways they found to be creative. Despite the physical limitations imposed by bound feet, many women found ways to express themselves through art, literature, and other forms of creativity. Their resilience and ingenuity are testaments to the human spirit's ability to thrive even under oppressive conditions. The story of foot-binding is not just about oppression, but about human strength, the power of women, and how societies can change. It serves as a powerful example of how cultural practices can evolve, and how individuals can push back against harmful traditions. The women who endured foot-binding, and those who fought to end it, are both symbols of courage and change. It reminds us that beauty should never cause harm. True beauty lies in the strength and resilience of the human spirit, not in conforming to painful and damaging standards. The legacy of foot-binding is a call to re-evaluate our own beauty standards and to ensure that they uplift rather than harm. It's a story of resilience, change, and the spirit of women who broke free from tradition and redefined beauty. Their journey from pain to empowerment is an inspiring testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the power of cultural transformation.